The ethical questions and considerations surrounding AI have evolved in tandem with the technology. In the early days, AI ethics was primarily concerned with the theoretical implications of machine intelligence. It was largely the realm of science fiction, exploring scenarios where AI surpassed human intelligence, posing existing threats and novel ethical dilemmas. But the advent of machine learning and LLMs, the hypotheticals have edged that much closer to reality. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Analytics Insight podcast, where we talk about the ever evolving tech space. And I'm your host, Priya Dayalani. Now, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and large language models have already had a significant impact on the world, and I believe it's still early days. That's why, as these tools become further integrated into our businesses, technologies, and everyday lives, developing ethical guidelines that support responsible AI governance and use will be the key. Joining us today is Vilas Dhar, President of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, to discuss why today's AI regulation debate often misses the point. It's not regulation versus innovation, but whether we are designing durable public institutions for AI. Hi, Vilas, how are you doing?
Priya, I am doing great, and I'm so delighted to be with you to explore these conversations today. Thank you for the welcome.
Great. It's a pleasure to have you on a podcast today, Vilas. And I'm really excited to, get started with our conversation because I've had multiple conversations around responsible and ethical AI, and I've been lucky enough to gather so much of insights with some leaders around the world. And today, yet again, we are going to explore a very different perspective from your end around ethical AI and what does it mean to, ensure that we are building durable public institutions for AI. So, without wasting much of a time, let's get started. And we would like to start by first understanding more about the organization. So, if you could help us understand about the organization, its fundamental principles, and along with that, we would also like to know about your journey, your role, and contribution towards the foundation.
Thank you, Priya. I'm happy to share. So, I come to this work from two very concrete angles. One, I am a computer scientist by training, an AI researcher going back 25 years, and I've spent my life absolutely gobsmacked by what we are capable of when humanity comes together to create and imagine new technologies. It's a what an empowering and enervating proposition that we could change the world just by coming up with new science. It's fantastic. But the other side of it, Priya, is I've also realized that just because we can create these technologies doesn't mean that the world changes around us. It requires something more than lines of code or scientific innovation. It requires us to transform how we think about building our businesses, our organizations, our governments, our society at large to ensure that we build for the purpose of creating a society that works for all of us, that centers human dignity. So, this has been my path. I've been a computer scientist, an executive, a human rights lawyer. And for the last decade, I've been tasked with building a new kind of institution. It's called the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. We have several billion dollars in assets, and we're asked to do a few things. The first, to really understand what these technologies represent for the possible futures for humanity, to guide decision makers and leaders in how to ensure that we get the best possible version of those futures, to work with partnership with our private sector leaders, our innovators, to ensure the technologies are built for a combination of purpose and profit, and to make sure that we're deploying them in the places where the world needs them most. We do three things. We work very closely to build the applications of AI for public good and ensure that the public feels a sense of ownership and agency in that development. We work with global leaders, business, and government across really hundreds of countries to ensure that regulation environment and the innovation environment is fit for purpose. And the final thing we do is we envision what institutions we might need for the future. I expect that we might talk about some of these in more detail. We are based in the United States, but work globally and have been really excited to spend a lot of time in India over the last few years, supporting and learning from an incredible innovation ecosystem.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Vilas, for that overview. And it's truly inspiring to learn about the vision behind the foundation and the meaningful work being done through it. And I think initiatives like these play a very crucial role in creating long-term impact, especially when they are backed by strong leadership and a clear purpose. Great. So, building on that, I think we know that each field of life follows ethics, a code of conduct or moral principles that distinguish between right and wrong. As AI is rapidly changing the way we live, work, and even interact with one another, it is increasingly important to consider the ethical implications of these technologies. The future of ethics in AI will play a critical role in shaping the development and deployment of AI systems and their impact on society. Now, one of the key challenges for ethics in AI is ensuring that AI systems are designed and used in ways that respect human rights, dignity, and autonomy. Now, this includes protecting privacy, preventing discrimination, and avoiding the creation of AI systems that perpetuate and amplify existing social inequalities. So, what I have come across is that ethical AI frameworks often exist on paper, but somehow fail during deployment or during the process of deployment. So, where do organizations typically struggle when moving from principles to core implementation?
That's a really great question, and we work very closely with companies around the world on this. Let me suggest two additions to your framing. The first is we often put the words ethical and AI next to each other, and it can be a little bit misleading because at the end of the day, AI systems, lines of code, and model weights, they don't have a responsibility for ethical behavior. Ethics are a human function. It's something that is actually guided by the developers, the users, the evaluators, the regulators, everybody involved around an AI system are the ones who actually have to hold ethics as a key priority. When we try to displace that responsibility to a system and say the system will behave ethically, we're giving up on a most fundamental human responsibility. If we take that frame, Priya, and we apply it to how organizations deploy AI ethics, I think we come to some of the core challenges you're identifying. These ethical principles often live in documents, in policies, and in frameworks, but they're disconnected from the places where tools actually get built. Where in the product design process are we ensuring that we're training our engineers and our business leaders to bring ethical processes to asking questions like, what will this decision we're being asked to make about a technical specification impact a person's life or their agency? Where in procurement, as institutions think about how they buy AI tools, are the actual people who are making decisions about what tools they will bring into the organization equipped with not just a policy, but a meaningful way to make real decisions about what will and won't pass their heuristic on what ethical action looks like. And maybe third, and most importantly, in the incentive structures that we create for engineers, for business leaders, for organizations, and for our society at large, where do we find both the positive incentives that say, when you design with human dignity in mind, you have a leg up over your competition. And equally, when you design a product that directly impacts people's well being in a negative way, there's a negative incentive for you around that. I'll give you an example that feels quite recent and quite painful. And I think about the evolution of social media. These are technologies that we didn't have as robust of a conversation about ethical outcomes, unfortunately. But what happened because of that was we built a mechanism in which the people who were designing these tools never actually had to ask questions about the ethical consequences of their design. We've had very, very senior and public folks come out of the social media companies and talk about how they were really just designing for the things that would capture our attention for as long as possible. They weren't asked to consider the mental health outcomes of what they were building or what it might mean for family structures or individual agency. And then when folks started using these tools, we also had to equip them with ethical frameworks. It's a long way of coming back around to a very core question. Are we here to design ethical AI, or are we more committed to designing an ethical society, one where AI is ever present, but isn't either a driver or a recipient of ethical outcomes, but instead humans are?
That's a great and interesting perspective, Vilas. And I think in many cases, the challenge lies in translating abstract principles like fairness or transparency, into measurable technical requirements that data scientists and product teams can actually implement. It's not always clear what fairness looks like in a specific model or how transparency should be embedded in a complex AI pipeline. Now,
That's exactly right, Priya. And if you don't mind, let me build on that because you
sure,
have given us a really concrete thing there.
sure.
I think about a place where companies really got this right was around cybersecurity. So leave aside social media. What happened with cybersecurity is there were some risks and some fears, but instead of continuing to think of it as an advisory function, it became an operational requirement that was embedded into the development cycle inside of companies. So, my practical advice today to anybody who's operating from a business perspective and sitting as an executive inside of an organization is to really understand and audit where your ethical commitments as a company intersect with the actual decision making workflows in the product. And if you look at it and you say, there's actually no point here where an ethical concern might slow or stop a product launch, then you don't really have governance, right? You have a set of principles that are hung up on the wall. Now, when you're actually able to look at the flip side of that and say, if I have a concern about a product that we're creating, or somebody on my staff does, and there's a meaningful mechanism by which that concern gets translated into review and into a new decision-making process, then you've kind of won the game in designing and building products that advance an ethical outcome.
Definitely. And I think when we talk more about it, I think the development and use of AI-based application and tools is definitely advancing rapidly, and including the research funding. Now, on the one hand, AI tools are employed for processing and analyzing data. And on the other hand, applications are used for tasks such as literature research, editorial work, and translation. I think that's very much clear with the advent of generative AI. So that way, the transformative nature of AI can impact numerous scientific disciplines. One way in which we can encourage and ensure that the development and deployment of trustworthy AI systems is to influence public and charitable funding. And significant funding is being awarded for AI projects, and such grants are, sought after. How important is funding from a macro perspective towards responsible and open research AI, Vilas?
Well, I think it's critical. Here's a few different perspectives on this. The first is if we think about the history of AI and even computing at scale, we see that even though today we might want to believe that this was entirely private sector driven, almost all of the foundational research discoveries, as well as the large scale implementations in the first decades of this practice, came because of public funding that was deeply embedded in the idea of research for the sake of advancing humanity's capacity. From the early days of the internet through to the capacity of creating supercomputing at scale, and even to some of the foundational research that put in the planks of the modern AI era. This came out of public funding that was developing tools that were supposed to be for public purpose. Today, we can't let up on that gas pedal. In so many ways, the private sector has stepped in and championed some incredible new innovation, but we should acknowledge that the incentives there are not always the same. That searching for building technology for profit means that you have a foundationally different practice than finding that technology for purpose. So, how do we actually build that? Well, I think there are three layers of infrastructure that are so necessary in order for us to realize this kind of promise of AI. The first is making sure that there's a public infrastructure for digital and AI tooling that everybody has access to. This can range from the foundational pieces of identity and data and ensuring that we can even participate on things like financial transactions. But maybe more important to this conversation, ensuring that there's spaces for small firms and businesses and individual innovators to have access to AI compute at scale. To couple that with public data sources, and this is something where I think India is actually excelling. The government has brought together these massive data sets that are representative of all kinds of economic, financial, agricultural, and health realities, and making them freely available to an innovation ecosystem. This isn't funding in the classic case of grant capital or providing investment. It's funding the infrastructure that allows for innovators to build on top of it. Ensuring that we have meaningful technical talent. Again, a place where we're no longer talking about rupees or dollars being invested into an ecosystem, but rather where that capital is funding the creation of an institutional infrastructure that trains a next generation of talent, not not just folks who want to go to private companies, but ones who want to bring to bear those incredible skills and capacities to create public outcomes. And third, understanding that capital needs to be accompanied by regulatory clarity. That when we don't know how governments are going to respond or shape markets, people act almost in Brownian motion. They run in every direction all the time, all at once. That's not functionally helpful. What we need is to ensure that in every place, you understand that if you're willing to invest in building a new product, a new tool, something that solves a local problem, not just that you won't be restricted from doing it, but that you'll actually be supported. And this, I think, is a critical part of this broader question of how we capacitate AI for public purpose at scale. Is we need capital, we need infrastructure, we need talent, and we need governmental support. I think if we bring those four things together, then all of a sudden you have an incredible driver for innovation in this space.
Absolutely, I agree with you, Vilas. And I think what you said, it highlights how funding shapes not just the speed of AI development, but also the values and direction of innovation itself. And I think from a macro standpoint, the nature of funding also determines whether AI research remains open, collaborative, and accessible, or gradually becomes concentrated with a handful of well resourced organizations. Because I think when funding flows into responsible and open research initiatives, it creates an ecosystem where startups, academia, and independent researchers can contribute meaningfully to advancing AI. Great. Now, I think despite these developments, global governance of AI remains fragmented. Now, countries differ significantly in their regulatory priorities, technological capabilities, and economic interests. Some governments prioritize innovation and economic growth, while others focus on privacy protection or national security. As a result, there is no single global framework governing AI development and deployment. And another major issue in global AI governance is the growing digital divide between developed and developing countries. Advanced economies, but obviously have the infrastructure, skilled workforce, and research institutions necessary to lead AI innovation, whereas many developing nations struggle with limited digital capacity. As I have observed, is that AI governance conversations are largely dominated by the Western institutions. How can emerging economies, like India, meaningfully participate in shaping global AI standards?
Well, I think in many ways, India has already stepped forward as a leader in shaping exactly those standards. I'm quite excited to see that. Let me acknowledge the framework you provided here. So you're absolutely right that we're seeing a fragmentation in the global mechanism around not just standards, but around the underlying principles and norms which guide them. And I think this is a real problem. I had the great privilege of serving at the United Nations. The Secretary General brought together a set of global experts on what he termed the high-level advisory body on AI. And we spent a year in hundreds, if not thousands, of consultations with companies and civil society organizations and governments around the world. The product of that was a set of recommendations that have now shaped a number of other follow-on activities, including the Global Digital Compact, which is a agreement among 150 plus countries to shape at least the basic foundations of what digital governance might look like. But you're absolutely right. No matter what we have been able to accomplish, what we've still got is a set of different approaches that are leading to new and difficult compliant mechanisms for companies around the world. What I think we need to do is probably focus on three different areas. The first is to begin with the concept of AI red lines. The idea that AI systems have certain possibilities that are so morally and ethically repugnant to us that we should condemn their use anywhere. This is a body of work that I've done with other senior AI scientists over 10 years, and some of these examples will feel, unfortunately, quite familiar in this moment. We've taken positions on things like AI tools being used to drive autonomous weapons systems, or allowing for the targeting and warfare of combatants, or even the use of AI systems that take too much agency and have too much control over our fixed and physical world. I think we need to move to a world where everybody can agree in global instruments to say there are simply some things that we just do not want AI to do in our lives, and that they need to be banned. That might be, unfortunately, the easiest of the three conversations ahead. The second is to recognize that this fragmented, fractured environment of compliance actually creates real problems for the innovation ecosystem. For companies that want to operate globally, they're now having to take on so many operating costs to just understand what local regulation looks like and to try to comply that they may have to make decisions that say, you know what, I just want to stay in my operating geography, in my environment. I think the participation of India in a global ecosystem of policy making allows us to also see that the global south has to have a voice in the global governance of these tools, that we can actually create shared frameworks that don't just originate from the technology providers in Silicon Valley, but come out of processes that directly represent billions of people and that actually set the norms for things like data protection, for privacy, for anti-surveillance mechanisms, and for ensuring that these tools allow for the right amount of cross-border porous information exchange. That doesn't mean all data should flow freely all the time, nor does it mean that no data should flow, but rather that we need governance mechanisms and guidance that allow companies to navigate what should be allowed to move and what shouldn't, how we ensure that we're protecting individual civil liberties, even as we are looking for the public possibility of these systems at scale. And the third, Priya, is maybe the most aspirational and the most abstract. I am very much an optimist about humanity, even if I'm less optimistic about technology by itself. One of the things I've seen over the last 20 years in the macro level, as we see kind of the fractures of the multilateral system writ large, is that technology policy is one of our shining hopes. It's a place where every country and every institution realizes that if we don't have at least a basic common framework, then it feels like everybody's out there on their own. And I don't think anybody wants that. What we've seen through the Global Digital Compact process, through the work of creating the International Scientific Advisory Body on AI, which was just announced a few weeks ago, and even the multi-sectoral dialogue on AI that'll happen this summer, is that countries who may not want to cooperate on other issues, on issues of energy or issues of political nature, do want to find a common framework on technology. And I think if we can take that momentum and we can continue to build on it, then we might actually see some meaningful advancements on this over the next few years.
That's a great thought, Vilas. And I think the reality is that AI's impact is truly global, and the voices of emerging economies are absolutely critical in shaping a more balanced and inclusive governance model. And eventually, I think the future of AI governance cannot be a one-size-fits-all model. It really has to reflect the needs, risks, and opportunities of both developed and developing economies. Yeah. So building on that thought, Vilas, from healthcare and finance to defense, AI technologies are increasingly integrated into almost every sector of society. And governments across the world recognize AI as a strategic asset that can influence economic growth and even geopolitical power. So, international organizations and governments and technology companies are actively shaping policies and frameworks that will determine how AI technologies are developed and deployed worldwide. So, in continuation to our earlier conversation, what policy or infrastructure framework and investments are required, and why are they most critical for building an equitable AI ecosystem in emerging markets?
That's a complex question. So let's take it from a few different angles. The first is to acknowledge that right now, the regulatory framework or the tension between different regulatory approaches has moved a little bit. It's not so much about whether there will be heavy regulation or light regulation, but rather the rift that's emerging between how some countries want to regulate based on how AI is built. This is what you might think of as the European model, which is focusing on the model, the training data, the risk classification, ensuring that we strip out bias and allow for equitable outcomes, versus those countries that are regulating based on how AI is used. And we're seeing this more in places like India and Southeast Asia, some of the African frameworks that focus on deployment contexts. They focus on how it impacts entire sectors. They think about population scale effects. Now, as a global expert on this topic, I'm not going to tell you that I think one is right and the other is wrong, but rather I'm going to highlight how important and essential it is that we have a convergence between these two approaches, that we create a mechanism by which we govern how the structural tension is useful, that we have to ensure that the development pieces of it are covered, that we have ethical frameworks in place for, as we talked about earlier in this conversation, how these tools are designed and developed, but that we also build institutions that are capable of monitoring how they're being used. If you really want to think about equitable deployment, the inputs into that question have to do with access, they have to do with agency, they have to do with control. If you want to think about equitable deployment through the context of consequences, you think about vulnerability, you think about differential impacts, and you think about institutions that can respond with enough voice and power that they're taken notice of. To me, that's a combined ecosystem of opportunity. If we could actually say, how do people come together and represent through shared voice their requirements for how these tools should be developed and built and used, then we might have something that recenters us from what technologists think is possible to what people think is necessary in their lives. In order to get there, we have to build some new mechanisms. And this is what I saw the start of even when I was in Delhi just a few weeks ago for the Global Summit. Countries around the world that are coming together to say, we actually need new mechanisms for public participation in these discussions, from citizens' assemblies and mechanisms that bring groups of people together to tangle with these complicated issues, all the way through to the responsibility of government to broaden the scope of how they're thinking about regulatory hearings, moving from conversations that are just between technology CEOs coming in and speaking to regulators to ones that have the full context of civil society around them, to share how a tool that's being deployed in a village context is leading to a reshaping of the economic fabric of that community, all the way through to how differential use in AI in education systems means that some students are being prioritized over others. Where I come to with this is often a place that feels quite comfortable. The conversations we have about AI and how it's being deployed very rarely have to do with AI itself. They have to do with our capacity to imagine new political and governance structures that bring people's voice back into foundational questions about the society that we want to create.
Those were some very insightful points, Vilas, and I think we definitely require a strong foundation of policy frameworks, digital infrastructure, and inclusive access to data and talent. And I think the need for governments and private enterprises and academic institutions, they all need to work in tandem. In many emerging markets, the challenge is not just adopting AI, but ensuring that the benefits of AI reach a wider population across both rural and urban regions, across industries, and even across different socioeconomic groups. And ultimately, I think if emerging economies get this balance right, AI has the potential to become a powerful equalizer, driving innovation, improving public services, and unlocking entirely new economic opportunities.
I think that's so right, Priya. And if you don't mind, I'll add one additional thought there
Sure.
because your comment really spurred something for me.
Yeah.
You know, one structural issue here, I write very extensively about these topics on platforms like LinkedIn, and so I invite your audience to join me there. But one of the pieces that I've been writing about recently is in so many of the ways that we regulate AI, we regulate it still as a product, a thing that companies make and ship. But really, I think that AI is beginning to function more like infrastructure because as AI operates, it reshapes our capacity to think about institutional decisions, to allocate resources, to think about what the actual societal decision makings are. Let me give you a more concrete example, right? We don't just say electricity is something that is regulated as a product. We actually think about it as infrastructure. We have shared standards. And when electricity grids run up against the borders of a country, we negotiate country to build agreements about standardization of what power lines are used and what the institutional infrastructure looks like to regulate and charge for it. This is a big shift that's happening in AI governance, that the unit of measure is moving from a single piece of product that's created by a company to thinking about coordination mechanisms that allow us to move AI and its associated impacts across people and communities and even across borders. And that requires participation and innovation from everyone. I know that probably many of our listeners today are coming out of the private sector and out of business sector settings. I think there's an incredible opportunity for companies to step forward and say, We actually want to think about how our products might be a part of this shared infrastructure. And in so doing, how we might help to shape what that institutional infrastructure ends up looking like.
Definitely, Vilas. And I think society hasn't seen a transformation like this since Industrial Revolution. Factories once mechanized our hands. Now AI is mechanizing that thought itself. The scale is staggering, reaching from personalized education and climate modeling to a more creative design and, of course, workplace automation. Because what once sounded futuristic is now very much ordinary. One last question for you, Vilas, is what are some significant societal problems you think AI can solve in the coming years?
It's a great question because this is the question that has consumed my life for the last 2 decades, Priya. So thank you for asking it. I'm going to reframe it a little bit. Too often the question becomes, how does AI solve a problem that humanity faces? And I'll be honest with you, in my entire career of building technology at large scale in private and public sector companies, I couldn't tell you a single story about how a technology solved a problem. Instead, I could tell you really compelling stories about how technology empowered people to solve the problems their communities face. And I know it may feel like unnecessary nuance, but at its core, then, is a philosophy that guides exactly how we should be building every product and innovation that we think about. Is if we put at the center of the question, how do we empower somebody to solve this problem? The kinds of technologies we develop change foundationally. Today, I could tell you that we probably have enough insight coming out of what we've already built in AI capacity coupled with geospatial intelligence to tell the world that we could fix the foundational problem of hunger. We know how to do it. But the technologies sitting as products and lines of code on computers somewhere don't change the social cultural indicators that transform how we think about health and food safety. It requires us to have a combined approach, one where we create technological capacity and we invest equally in investing in behavior change, in supporting and capacitating decision makers to understand how to use these tools, in ensuring that they have mechanisms of political will and support to have the financing necessary and to have the public communications necessary to make these changes happen. This is maybe what I would share with you as the key insight that's come out of our decades of work in this space is technology systems don't work in an isolation. They work because we invest so meaningfully in building the social structures that take technology capacity and turn it into shared outcomes. And I'll give you a few examples of incredible spaces where that's happening today. There's an example that comes from India itself, a body of work that we've done with community health workers that go out and ensure that some of the most vulnerable people and some of the most last mile spaces in India have access to high quality medical triage and care. For 20 years, people have done this work by hand, traveling in cars and then on motorbikes and walking to these villages, ensuring that they are providing human to human single person care at scale. Well, that work now gets massively transformed by AI because we can take that 20 years of data and experience and wisdom and we can build population level health models that let us understand not just what one person is experiencing, but what an entire village is experiencing, how it fits within the context of the hundreds of villages around them. And it lets us identify things like clusters of villages that might have consistently worse health outcomes. Now, that's a technology driven insight that then needs to be coupled back to sending out doctors and sociologists who can go and understand why these villages are experiencing these outcomes. That comes through interviews and human connection, through analytics on the ground, as well as these narrative based forums to drive new insights. In this particular case, I'm thinking of to identify a cluster of villages that have different cultural practices around what they eat, around nutritional inputs for young mothers, that once identified mean that organizations like this can work with the government to ship in some nutritional supplements that without changing cultural practices lead to meaningful health outcomes for these people. It's a long way of describing a pretty short insight. Build the tool, then understand the community well enough to reshape how that tool is used and put power in the hands of people to change their own circumstances. That's the incredible opportunity ahead with AI.
Definitely, Vilas. And I think the opportunity before us is enormous. Imagine a world where AI enhances human creativity instead of replacing it, where technology bridges inequality rather than deepening it. The future depends on choices made today to design responsibly, to educate continuously, and to innovate inclusively. And the impact of artificial intelligence on society will be written by all of us. Every business that designs with conscience, every policymaker who acts with foresight, and every individual who chooses to use AI for good, they all shape the story ahead. Thank you so much, Vilas, for taking out the time and effort to be on a podcast today and helping us understand that AI is reshaping global governance, economic competition, and international power structures as countries compete to develop advanced AI technologies and influence global rules. Digital governance has become an important area of international growth and politics. Thank you so much, Vilas, for your insights. It was lovely chatting with you.
Thank you, Priya. That was a very inspiring closing, and thank you for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much, Vilas. So, this is for our listeners. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion around ethical AI, responsible AI governance, what future look like, and what is the role the entire society can play in terms of ensuring responsible AI deployment. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes, and you can view all our previous episodes on Spotify and other leading platforms. Thank you so much.